A very warm welcome to the IISS. My name is Bastian Gigerich. I'm the Director for Defense and Military Analysis here at the Institute and your host and moderator this evening. It's my great pleasure to chair this event, The Road from Sarajevo, British Army Operations in Bosnia 1995 to 96. I think a book launch is always a special occasion, in particular so when the author is a colleague. So it is my honor and a privilege to host this conversation this evening. Ben Barry, our Senior Fellow for Land Warfare in the Defense and Military Analysis Department here at the Institute, will speak in a minute or so to us about the book. I think you'll have some audiovisual material as well that will part of the evening. We have, of course, just passed a few months ago the 20th anniversary of the Dayton Accord that ended, at least in political terms, that violent conflict, that civil war. But of course, after that accord, it took a significant military commitment to implement it on the ground. I4, the so-called implementation force, under NATO's heading. And I think Ben will speak a bit about the experience that he had in that setting from the perspective of the 2nd Battalion of the Light Infantry. I think it'll be very interesting to hear and see what lessons you draw, Ben, what impressions you want to convey. And I know, I don't know whether you want to make that part of the conversation, but I know you, of course, also have a view that these operations also told us or had an influence on everything that came after. And maybe you want to say a few words about that as well. I should mention, though, before I hand over to Ben, that the book is available here this evening at a discount, and I hope that you all take advantage of that and buy it for £10. And I'm sure Ben can be convinced to sign it if you ask nicely. So I hope you'll take advantage of that later on. But Ben, we're all very, very much interested in what you have to say. So please, I'll shut up now and hand over to you, Ben. Please, the floor is yours.
I've got about a quarter of an hour's worth of remarks, but also a quarter of an hour of contemporary video. Now, most recent books about the army have been about the unpopular wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Many have covers that represent the prominent sand and brown hues of Helmand or southern Iraq. Many of them have plenty of action verbs in the title and have implied or actual exclamation marks. There are, for example, at least 5 that tell the stories of battalions, including 2 books about the 3rd Parachute Regiment, a book about the Welsh Guards, a book about the Scots Guards, and a book about the Royal Anglians. But only one of those is written by the commanding officer. This book goes back further in time and covers the operations conducted in Bosnia in 1995-96 by a British infantry battalion. And only the British Army could have a battalion called 2nd Battalion the Light Infantry that was equipped with 70 40-ton armoured vehicles. But that's one of the idiosyncrasies of the British Armed Forces. Now, I had the privilege of commanding that battalion on operations, and unashamedly in the book, I explain my role, particularly in making decisions and giving orders and direction. But I also make as much use as I can of the perspectives of everybody else in the battalion. So as well as using the battalion's official war diary, I make much use of the large archive we assembled of reports and accounts by large numbers of members of the battalion, from major down to private soldier. So I aimed to give as complete a picture as I could of the roles everyone had to play. Now, it's easy to forget how difficult the situation was in Bosnia in 1995. There'd been 3 years of war from mid-1992 to the autumn of 95. It was a complex and unpleasant triangular conflict between the largely Muslim Bosnian government forces, Bosnian Croat forces and Bosnian Serb forces. The UN's operations in Bosnia had only had limited success. The UN mandate was restrictive, warlords had the initiative, and many of the UN's contingents were neither equipped nor trained for the dangerous and volatile environment of the biggest war in Europe since 1945. And it's easy to forget just what a shock to Western European people and governments this war in the former Yugoslavia was. And things got worse in 1995. In the spring, there was Bosnian Serb seizure of UN hostages. There was then the capture of Srebrenica, which we now know resulted in a terrible massacre. And the UN gradually adopted a more forceful approach. In early autumn 1995, Bosnian Serb shelling of Sarajevo resulted in combined United Nations and NATO airstrikes and artillery attacks on Serbian military targets. And indeed, I was on Mount Igman as this was happening on my reconnaissance. At the same time, though, in western Bosnia, the Bosnian Croat army was pushing back the Bosnian Serbs. These factors, combined with the decisive military and political engagement of the United States, created the political conditions that allowed the US to bring all three sides and the Croat and Serb leaders to the conference table at Dayton, where the late Richard Holbrooke engineered the signing of the Dayton Agreement that ended the war and both divided Bosnia into two entities, the Bosnian Serb Republic and the Croat Muslim Federation. And as an unscripted aside here, I think it is sad that Richard Holbrooke and General Sir Rupert Smith, who was the commander of the UN forces at the time, didn't share a Nobel Peace Prize for actually playing a decisive role in bringing a war to an end. If that's what the Nobel Peace Prize should be about, I don't know. Anyway, the Dayton Peace Agreement required the Bosnian forces to withdraw from the front lines within 30 days and to withdraw to barracks 90 days later. These and other clear and progressive measures to demobilise the faction forces were to be enforced by the deployment of the NATO Implementation Force, the IFOR. And the IFOR had unlimited authority to compel the faction military, including by force if necessary. The only time in my life I've ever had unrestricted authority to use force. Now, the agreement endorsed the political and military consent to peace at the strategic level and NATO's roles, but many previous winter ceasefire agreements in Bosnia had unravelled the next spring. Now, it's easy to forget the tensions and uncertainties of late 1995 and the apprehension about NATO's first ever land operation. Would the warring armies comply with the agreement so hastily negotiated at Dayton? Would NATO troops suffer the same non-cooperation, harassment and attacks as the UN forces? Would NATO have to use force? Would there be casualties? I want to give you a short flavour of our advanced force operations in western Bosnia. These are from contemporary BBC news broadcasts. Not all the speakers are captioned, but some of you may recognise a rather youthful brigadier called Richard Dannett. Well, on the transfer of authority from the UN to the NATO IFOR, our battalion had to implement the military aspects of the Dayton Agreement in a large chunk of northwest Bosnia. Now, most of the Bosnian Muslim-held territory had recently been recaptured from the Serbs and was devastated. Everywhere there were burned-out villages, signs of recent fighting, and bodies of dead faction soldiers. The area was effectively lawless, as a constant rattle of gunfire every night demonstrated. So there were 700 of us with about 100 armoured vehicles, and we had to supervise the activities of over 100,000 faction troops along a 150-kilometre front line in terrain that was rather like the Welsh borderlands. Now, the military timeline of the Dayton Agreement could only be achieved with NATO reassuring both sides that they could comply without their security being threatened by non-compliance on the other side. So our top priority was to reinforce compliance and to deter non-compliance. And this was achieved by a robust operational presence. It was essential to be impartial. Now, in the event, our military activities in those 30 days were successful, apart from the full lifting of mines. So I've got a couple more video clips for you here that give you a flavour of those operations. Firstly, the response to a shooting attack on one of my checkpoints, which was the first ever shooting attack against the NATO IFOR. and then the efforts to lift mines on the front line, and finally the withdrawal of faction forces at the 30-day point, which was supervised and monitored by NATO. As the faction forces withdrew to barracks, we were able to devote an increasing amount of time to promoting reconstruction and development, as well as what is now called information operations, and also dealing with the troubling implications of the abundant evidence of human rights violations and war crimes that was all about us. And these final video clips show some of that. They also show the run-up to the final withdrawal of the Bosnian forces to their barracks. And they also give you a hint of the information operations afterwards. So, by summer 1996, a ceasefire had held by half a year. The murderous faction armies had disengaged. The paramilitary ethnic cleansing bully boys had disappeared back into the woodwork. And we were beginning the process of demobilisation. And as this picture shows, the predominantly agricultural economy was beginning to return to normal. Now, the book is full of descriptions from different points of view of what actually happened. But in the last but one chapter, I reflect on the ingredients of our success. I mean, the areas we covered were large. The task was complex. There was a lack of intelligence. The situation was often confused. And the inherent friction arising from the multinational nature of the force necessitated a clear understanding of the mission, and particularly what was going on politically. And that allowed you to react quickly to changing situations or fleeting opportunities. And there are plenty of examples in my book of commanders using their judgment and leadership ability to overcome unexpected challenges. I mean, this photograph here is of Lieutenant Peter Chapman, who you saw pointing out the bodies earlier. And here he is actually organising the clearance of a minefield alongside a Bosnian Muslim battalion commander. And there are plenty of vignettes that illustrate that sort of thing. This is a picture of me on far right having a meeting with the Chief of Staff of the Bosnian Muslim 5th Corps. And the only place we could find that was less than freezing cold was huddling around a small fire in the midst of a completely abandoned village on a couple of children's sledges that had been left there. I mean, I do identify other lessons in the book. One of my main assessments was that all our operations had a political role, and in this came the importance of influencing attitudes and perceptions. And I noted that much of the conflict was in the minds of the Bosnian people, the Bosnian military, and their political leaders. So what at the time we called psychological operations, and are now fashionably called information operations, these became increasingly important, getting our messages across to as many as the actors and as many of the people as we could. And I just want to show you 3 photographs of a day in the life of Major Richard Smith, who was the company commander you saw having a conversation with the slightly haggard Bosnian officer. But here is Richard on the day that video clip was filmed with some of his command team and his blonde lady interpreter, actually just having a friendly chat with the Bosnian Serb brigade commander. Here is Richard later the same day with a Bosnian battalion commander, but with the mayor of the town of Selinaj. And actually what they were doing was arranging for a concert in the cinema by the band that we happen to have with us at the moment. And that evening, here is Richard doing a phone-in program on a commercial radio station in Banja Luka. And the book also describes a lot of events that, taken out of context, can be seen very bizarre. But through an incredibly bizarre combination of circumstances, I ended up with my own 3-hour weekly radio show on this Bosnian radio station. The book also deals with the challenges of communications and logistics, both of which were stretched, sometimes to breaking point. Also morale and discipline. And here is a key link in the morale and discipline chain. The Sergeant Major of a company. We had to live and operate in a harsh climate, and it was a more demanding environment and a greater degree of uncertainty than that particular battalion had ever experienced, either in training or in Northern Ireland, where most of its previous operations had been. But the key contribution to our success was the benefit we gained from quality people who had quality training, individual training, collective training, and also the special work-up training we did for Bosnia, as well as the mental preparation of soldiers and officers for uncertainty, hardship, and a degree of physical deprivation. And this gave everyone such confidence in themselves, their comrades, and their equipment that none of the uncertainties, setbacks, or difficulties of the tour dented morale. So I wrote my book in the 3 or 4 years after the end of the tour, but it wasn't published in its first edition until 2008. The publishers approached me last year and asked for a second edition to reflect the 20th anniversary of the Dayton Agreement, and they agreed that I could write an afterword to put the operations in a broader and deeper context, and also to identify lessons that were less obvious to us at the time the book was written. Now, much of the complex military and political context and conflict in Bosnia was specific to that country. And of course, we had what now appears almost unique circumstances that British involvement in the war was popular with the press, politicians, and the British people. Indeed, out of the 700 people I took to Bosnia with me, about 40 had volunteered to go to Bosnia because they felt the war was an outrage and felt something should be done. And one of those actually includes Tobias Ellwood, the current junior Foreign Office Minister, who wanted to spend his last year in the army making a difference. What I think we can also see from this conflict is that NATO force had great utility, a utility that actually subsequently endured. And all the political and military alignment of the planets and the Dayton Agreement acted to create an irreversible momentum that made it increasingly unlikely that the entities could revert to using the military instrument to restart a war. And from 1996, NATO forces had continued utility, for example, in countering the attempted coup by Bosnian Serb hardliners in Banja Luka, and also in finding and arresting war crimes suspects. So military outcomes had political effects, but it was increasingly politics rather than military affairs that became the decisive factor in Bosnia. And I saw this myself when I returned in 2003. But after 9/11, the more challenging environments of Afghanistan and Iraq provided a greater test. And for example, we saw the US-led coalitions in Iraq and Afghanistan struggle to adequately coordinate military action with political activity, reconstruction and development. Now, I had plenty of opportunity to reflect on this in my last year in the Army, where I spent my time writing the British Army's analysis of its role in the stabilisation of Iraq. And Iraq was a more demanding operation than Bosnia. There were periods of intense fighting and often tactical success. But overall, the British campaign in Basra came close to failure, and Britain's military reputation and confidence was damaged. Overall, the British in Iraq were not as effective as they could have been. Now, the reasons for this were complex, and I'm sure will be examined in exhaustive detail by the Chilcot inquiry when it reports. But quite clearly, early failures to prevent instability, the failure to find weapons of mass destruction, and the rising toll of casualties rapidly eroded public support in the UK. There were complex failures with many contributing factors and multiple examples of suboptimal decision-making in Washington, D.C., London, Central Command, Baghdad and Basra. But there was a real sense that I gathered from talking to many British and American actors that in 2003, the US and UK military and political leadership had expected that stabilisation operations in Iraq would most likely resemble operations in Bosnia, or indeed subsequently in Kosovo. Now, when I look back at the operations described in this book, and the video clips bring it home vividly, I'm struck that the challenges and demands they made on us at the time seemed to be exceptional, and in many ways they were. But there was relatively little actual combat. Indeed, out of the 3 firefights involving British NATO troops in northwest Bosnia, 2 of them are actually described in this book. There was a similar lack of fighting in the British sector in Kosovo, and in British operation in Sierra Leone saw only 2 periods of combat involving British forces. I believe that this success may have resulted in a degree of overconfidence, an expectation that future opponents would be as easily counted by British forces as they had been in Bosnia. So when British troops in Iraq and later in Afghanistan found themselves fighting against enemies who rejected Western values and who were prepared to stand, fight and die, the shock was profound. It was an uncomfortable reminder that in war the enemy has a vote and may be prepared to fight to the death to cast it. So the unexpected intensity of the fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, combined with the unpopularity of the war, to produce a serious strategic shock to the British government, its Ministry of Defence and the Army, and all were too slow to adapt. But that is another story. But I do believe that for all our sense of achievement and the considerable difficulties we had to overcome in 1995-96, and of which we were rightly proud, that there was a degree of setting the conditions for overconfidence in 2003 and 2006. Now, I'm not seeking to denigrate or belittle the achievements of the NATO troops that deployed over that harsh winter across front lines that had seen close-up evidence of intense fighting, terrible war crimes and ethnic cleansing. And I hope that comes out in the book. So there we are. That's enough from me. We'll be taking questions in a moment. For those of you who are sufficiently interested to want to get hold of a copy of the book, it retails for £15, slightly cheaper on Amazon, but tonight I'm selling it for £10. And the other thing is that half the money that's made by the book will go to a charity called Care for Casualties, which deals with wounded veterans from the Rifles, the regiment that absorbed 2nd Battalion and the Light Infantry.
Ben, thank you very much for that introduction to the book and the points you made. I'm going to invite people to comment, ask questions, and make observations of their own. But I am struck by both from what you said and also what featured in the helpful videos that you included into your presentation by how many of the themes that now seem to puzzle people in current and very recent conflict already appeared in rather stark clarity and contrast at the time. And I think maybe we want to talk about that a little bit in a moment. And I think your point that the selective application of force in this case has worked. I think that's one of your main points, but people might have then drawn the wrong conclusion from that moment, and I think there's an interesting question in there whether that is actually unavoidable or what we could do to get better at interpreting what this means for future conflict. I think that might be something that I'd invite you to speak on in a moment, but I want to see whether we have comments, questions from the audience. Yes, sir, in the last row.
Charles Vivian, a member of the Institute. Ben, I wonder, could you say something more about the rules of engagement under which you're operating? And a slightly wider question, but associated. If the three parties have not chosen to adhere to the accord, do you think you were in a position to force their acquiescence?
So,
if I may, the first 7 weeks of the tour, which we spent on UN operations, the standard rules of engagement were primarily self-defence. But by then, the UN itself, and indeed the British contingent in the UN, had given itself rules of engagement that allowed it the ability to do a certain amount of offensive operations. Indeed, those were the rules of engagement under which the NATO airstrikes of August-September 95 and the UN shelling were conducted. For the NATO IFOR, the rules of engagement for everyone included that foundation of self-defence. But IFOR had this unlimited authority, which, by the way, had been endorsed by a UN Security Council resolution, to use force to compel compliance. there are a number of occasions in which we came very close to doing that, and these range from the low level to the theatre. One of the stipulations of the Dayton Agreement was that I4 should have unlimited access and unlimited mobility. So the UN had been hamstrung by checkpoints, as the then Brigadier Danitz said. We now had the authority to crash through checkpoints and, if necessary, kill everyone who was trying to stop us going through the checkpoint. Now, we never had to do that, and we were trying to apply force with selection and precision. So each of the vehicles in the whole battalion were equipped with a piece of paper in the 3 Bosnian languages and English, saying, to be given to people at checkpoints, saying, if you don't let us through in 5 minutes, we will use force. And that worked every single time. There was an occasion for which I actually had to mobilise a company and dispatch it down to Sarajevo, when the separation of forces in Sarajevo, Tito Barracks in the heart of Sarajevo, which is a mighty sort of communist-era huge barrack building, the Bosnian government forces were refusing to withdraw from it, even though it was in the zone of separation. So the French-led Sarajevo sector prepared a multinational operation to be predominantly conducted by French troops, but with armoured infantry companies from the British, which was my A company, and also from the US division up in Tuzla. And indeed, a pack of street fighting urban warfare equipment was flown out double quick by the Royal Air Force in its Hercules. And I've no doubt that had push comes to shove, we would have attacked Tito Barracks. There was also a whole sequence of events around a disputed small town called Kulen Vikun, right on the edge of Bosnia, where Bosnian Croat paramilitary police, bully boys, had occupied it, and NATO determined that they weren't going to be allowed to stay. And we engaged in messaging, a lot of messaging and dialogue with the Bosnian Croat commander there, right up the Bosnian Croat command chain. In addition, we ostentatiously started moving forces to ring the place, but in a very ostentatious display. And we also prepared for an armoured infantry battalion, namely, 2LI, to do a close assault to evict them. And it was the only time in the whole tour I sharpened my bayonet and checked the pins on my grenades. But in the event, the Bosnian Croats backed down. And if I may take it one level further, and this is discussed in the book, both in terms of the incidents, but also that there's a more analytical bit. Deciding where to set the cursor on the use of force, that is really serious stuff, and it's what commanders at all levels really get paid for, and the decision becomes more difficult the higher they go up. But we were very lucky because the peace agreement was so unambiguous. The political, the strategic, the operational, and the tactical leadership of all 3 factions had agreed to it. They were all very war-weary. There was a tangible feeling of war weariness. There was a state of exhaustion amongst those factions, both civilian and military. And finally, you had this unambiguous provision in the Dayton Agreement endorsed by the Security Council that I4 had unlimited authority to use force to compel the implementation of the military measures.
Yes, please, in the middle.
In the news video, I think I remember they said that part of the reason for the heavy artillery being paraded around was to give an impression of substance compared to other forces in the region. And how concerned were NATO or UK commanders that such artillery, such force would be required and the situation would escalate? Or were they quite confident that there wasn't going to be that kind of force required and there wouldn't be more necessity of using force in the area?
Well, I think in the run-up to it, it was, I wouldn't say people were anxious or afraid, but this was a matter of quite substantial concern. And no one knew how it was going to turn out, because the 3 previous winters in Bosnia, there had been various ceasefires, including a moderately successful one negotiated by ex-President Jimmy Carter. But no one could safely predict that people weren't going to get messed about again, and that the three factions were going to live up to the military elements of the deal. And I can remember once or twice getting quite shirty about this. For example, when the Dayton Peace Agreement was actually announced, my intelligence officer in a battalion conference, sort of came in, with the World Service on an HF radio, saying this is peace in our time. And I was quite shirty, saying that's a bit of an unfortunate phrase, Tony. The other thing I have to say is we were exceptionally lucky in being really well prepared and trained. I mean, the battalion had done 18 months of solid training with pretty unlimited training resources, both at the British Army's Armoured Warfare Centre on the Prairie in Canada and at the fantastic training area in Senelaga. And we'd actually rehearsed offensive operations. So we'd rehearsed with live ammunition, doing a variety of attacks and reacting to ambushes. And we'd actually taken over the whole training area. And with the support of another battalion, we'd created a sort of Bosnia in miniature. And on the final day of our exercise, in the biggest training manoeuvre that had been done on Senelaga since the end of the Cold War, we actually rehearsed the actual plan for breaking the siege of Sarajevo, which existed. And what I try and convey in the book, which I found quite difficult sometimes to convey to people without a military background, is when you're really well trained, you really have enormous confidence in your capabilities and the capabilities of everybody in the team at whatever level. I mean, the only thing I've come across that really sort of equals it is being in a really high-performing sports team.
Yes, please. First question here, and then we've got another one in the first row. Yes, please.
Thank you. Tim Lawrence, member of the Institute. Ben, it's good to notice 20 years on you don't look a day older. Maybe the absence of an elder.
Yeah.
I was wondering if there was anything that you felt that you got wrong. You talked a lot about what went right, but that you got wrong, or perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, you would do differently on the operation.
Very good question. Just give me a moment. I think, I have reflected on this. In the book, I describe 4 incidents where my battalion headquarters and I, because ultimately I'm just part of the battalion headquarters, no commander should ever allow themselves to have an exaggerated assessment of themselves. They're part of that sort of command and control node. There are about 4 incidents where we made wrong judgment calls, but in every one of them we were luckily able to recover out of the spin, and in a couple of cases turn an initial self-imposed setback into a bit of an opportunity. And when we rewound the videotape of life in the battalion headquarters and talked to the people who actually helped get us out of the trouble on the ground to learn the lessons, all 4 of those scenarios were due to us not having realised that the situation had changed. And on each occasion of those, we attempted to tighten it up. But that wasn't bad out of about the sort of 25 different operations we did, and no one was killed or injured as a result. The other thing I think, reflecting this and drafting the afterword gave me cause for reflection, is if I had my time again, I'd have spent even more time out on the ground, on the front line, meeting and talking with Bosnian military commanders, local political actors, but also spending even more time with my platoons and troops and soldiers. And I probably should have actually praised them for the remarkable job they were doing a bit more.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Sarah Ingham, Institute member. I wonder if you could expand, please, on the impact you think the operation had on NATO especially in the later context, that it was said it had to go out of area or go out of Bosnia?
Very good question. Between 92 and the transfer to NATO in 1995, NATO had effectively subcontracted, or was a subcontractor of the UN, because it had agreed to provide fire support through NATO air power. And also there were all sorts of plans for in extremis extraction of the UN force if it had all turned into anarchy and the international community had decided to withdraw. And indeed my battalion was on standby for about 18 months beforehand to be the leading British battalion had things gone to rats. And that would have been a really high risk and quite interesting operation. But there was great political and military tension between NATO and the UN, because many in NATO, and indeed in the United States, in the military and political communities, were very impatient with the UN's limitations, though those on the ground felt that this was rhetorical and there was a lot more NATO could contribute. There were a number of intemperate comments by senior NATO or US people. Part of this was also a result of, I'm afraid, President Clinton's government being disengaged from Bosnia, and Clinton himself, there's plenty of evidence of this, had not really realised that in the US signing up to the NATO support to the UN force, there were actually, this implied, US troops being used on the ground in a combat role if it all turned to rats. So, first of all, the sort of tensions within NATO and with the UN were greatly reduced by the success of the operation. I think it also gave NATO's senior political and military leadership a real sense that they could do things, which was probably the foundation of NATO's role in Kosovo. The other thing which you probably heard much about in the context of Afghanistan was the fashionable word partnership of non-NATO countries integrating into a NATO military operation and sending their contingents. Well, there's actually quite a bit of that, and we saw for ourselves Malaysian and Swedish contingents come into the NATO force, albeit through a force of certification. I think there are a number of things that NATO could do better. It could have done much better on air-land integration, and actually it was really frustrating that there was a big disconnect between us on the ground and NATO air power, and apparently strikingly different rules of engagement. But I think, to be fair to NATO, in Afghanistan there has been the most amazing degree of air-land integration, probably the greatest degree in any war since air power was invented.
Yes, please, over here, and then the lady in the middle.
My name is Grace Miller, I'm serving Army officer. To what extent were the various civilian agencies integrated into your direct chain of command? Was this a sense that this was a military operation that was setting the conditions for civilian agencies to work, or were you working hand in glove at the time? And perhaps you could compare that with the approach in Afghanistan.
It's a very good question. No doubt about it, I saw some really good work by various international humanitarian and relief agencies, particularly during the UN period in and around Sarajevo. But where we were serving in northwest Bosnia, much of that had been under the control of the Bosnian Serbs. And with the exception of some relief agencies from Orthodox countries, for example Bulgaria and Russia, there was very little presence of international non-governmental organisations. At the time, I describe in the book a rather standoffish attitude from the International Committee of the Red Cross, who were very grateful for our protection, but really rather arrogant and inflexible, but they had to maintain their impartiality. And don't get me wrong, they did do a good job in arranging prisoner exchanges, for example, between the sides. What we saw, though, was the Overseas Development Administration, which at that time was an integral part of the UK Foreign Office, quickly deploy a forward presence to the British divisional headquarters, and they were very capable of helping leverage money into reconstruction projects. So for a number of occasions, these big heavy warriors wrecked roads. Well, we could very quickly get money for the roads to be repaired by a combination of British sappers, but also local Bosnian contractors. There were quite a lot of frustrations, though, in the British area, and this was partly because the place the NGOs were drawn to was central Bosnia, and indeed to round Sarajevo. And I was on a number of occasions reminded that many of these NGOs are businesses. You know, part of their business model is charity. There's one remarkable encounter which I'll share with you. A patrol of mine in a town called Cluj, which was a not particularly distinguished town that was in rather a bad way, were astonished, I think, shortly between Christmas and New Year, to see coming down the high street at them a Postman Pat style red post office van with British number plates. So they sort of hailed it down. And it was being driven by a retired British cavalry major general and someone else from this Dorset village. And they'd seen what was going on with Bosnia, and they'd filled the thing with relief supplies and wanted some advice on where to send it. I'd also commend to you, there was an excellent children's charity called the Serious Road Trip, which was a load of sort of expeditionary hippies. So they did really good work with children who'd seen some quite disturbing work. There's a serious point here, though, is when there was this attempted Bosnian Serb putsch by hardliners in 1997, the High Representative, who was the leader of the civilian effort, or coordinator of the civilian effort in Bosnia, was given by the international community and subsequently endorsed by a Security Council resolution what was called the bomb powers, which included the ability to sack any public official and also an in extremis ability to impose laws. And a number of high representatives, most particularly Paddy Ashdown, who was there as the High Representative when I was back there in 2003, really engaged in serious politics to try and move the political situation on in Bosnia. And the way that the High Representatives organisation did this actually led to proper synchronisation of development agencies, key NGOs, those who were amenable to synchronisation, but also to a degree of useful synchronisation between what the military was doing and the political line.
I think we've got time for one more question. Yes, please. Yeah.
If I may return to a point made earlier about the lessons we could learn from the current situation today, which is put in simply Russian allies who are cleansing. Is there any lessons we can learn from this extent? I'm supposing that you're talking only about military success, not political success. I'd be happy to talk about political.
Well, I think there's a strategic issue. All right, Bosnia was less dangerous than Iraq and Afghanistan turned out to be, but there's still quite a lot of useful lessons. And I'd commend to you Paddy Ashdown's book, Swords and Ploughshares, which he wrote after he'd finished his tenure as the International High Representative, which is a very good analysis of this, which appeared to have no impact on those directing operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. But for people who study such things, I think there's a lot of very good textbook lessons. We shouldn't forget, though, in a sense, how lucky it was that the planets aligned the way they did to allow the Dayton Agreement to be negotiated. Decisive political and military engagement by President Clinton, and this unique barnstorming personality of Richard Holbrooke, who to a certain extent browbeat the political leadership at Dayton into the agreement, plus real war weariness amongst the three factions, and also international sanctions really starting to bite. And, if you look, for example, at the complex and much worse war in Syria, it strikes me that we haven't yet reached that sort of condition where the planets align enough for some sort of peace deal. I think you mentioned ethnic cleansing. I think the International Court for former Yugoslavia and then the subsequent arrangement between a coalition within NATO, including the UK, the US and France, that they would use a discrete intelligence-led special forces operation to try and round up indicted war criminals to get them to justice in The Hague. Plus there were negotiations with, there were secret negotiations with war criminals, a number of whom handed themselves in. I think that and the development of the International Criminal Court, there is some evidence that you could form a view that this has changed the behaviour of heads of government and senior military people in similar internal wars, and they may think twice about commissioning ethnic cleansing. Now, the International Criminal Court has limitations, and of course it all depends on the political context. But in a sense, a new human right was invented in Bosnia, which was your right not to be ethnically cleansed. So I suppose that's ending on a high note.
Well, Ben, actually, I was gonna ask you one more thing, and again, because I think you mentioned, I think you said, despite difficult circumstances, morale was never dented. Of the deployed troops. You also mentioned the fact that public support, political support was high, and again, I think from a soldier's perspective, being on operations, that public support, that political support, in terms of motivation and morale, how important is that? Is that something that actually matters to people on a day-to-day basis? I mean, it's just something, again, that strikes me as unless you have been in that situation, it's probably difficult to understand how that bond actually plays out in practical terms. I was wondering whether you had any reflections on that.
I mean, there was the old. I have to be frank and say there were times when there was the odd dip in morale, and of course this is really pre-internet. It's email. It's pre-Twitter, and there were some of us from time to time who found sort of relying on snail mail pretty difficult, and indeed many soldiers had to relearn the art of letter writing. But those were minor dips, and I think the sort of team spirit is such a multiplier for morale when things are difficult. I think certainly within the British Army, and I have detected it in other armies, one of which at least is represented in this room. You get well-trained professional soldiers that have had the opportunity to train together and bond together. They take a perverse satisfaction in toughing it out, despite it all. And I'm quite sure that's one of the things that's kept troops in really difficult circumstances, UK, US, Canadian, that's kept them doing the business in the face of not only the war being increasingly unpopular, but significant levels of casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan. But it was very, I'd done quite a few tours in Northern Ireland, and Northern Ireland, broadly speaking, the British Army's role was supported by the press, politics and the media. But we were very lucky to be there at a time to force the pace and see this transformation from armies at war to armies in barracks that were going nowhere, and the economy kick-starting again. But we did need to take that with a pinch of salt. And my final anecdote is we managed to sort of suspend operations for Christmas Day, and myself and battalion headquarters were in a agricultural shed of a sort of trashed agricultural installation in a room about the same size as this and about 3 times as long. And on Christmas Day, after the traditional British Army serving of something called gunfire, which is sort of hot tea or coffee with liberal dosings of rum, to the soldiers by the officers, we had a period of time before, through some miracle of logistics, everybody was able to sit down to a Christmas lunch with turkey. Unbelievable logistic feat. But Steve, who was my press officer, said, everybody's got lots of Christmas cards, but here are 2 big sacks of Christmas cards just addressed to an officer and a soldier. And what I propose, we, the officers, soldiers, and everybody who works actually in the hardcore of the tactical headquarters, what we'll do is we'll spend a couple of happy hours opening these. So, shared them out at random, and I took my share of opening them. And the very last one I opened was from an organisation which I've subsequently come to know, a bit of a band of brothers, the Signals Platoon of 1st Battalion, King Shropshire Light Infantry. And they'd fought together in the Korean War. And it was addressed to the commanding officer and all ranks. And the inscription went something like this: "We've been seeing what you've been doing on television. It looks pretty wintry and pretty hilly, rather like it was in Korea. Wishing you and all the battalion the very best of luck at this decisive time in the history of the war-torn Balkans." And actually that was quite sobering, because having, I already knew something of the history of 1st Battalion, the King Shropshire Light Infantry in Korea, who had served in similar terrain, but without the 1990s technology, and actually against a ferocious enemy. And I suppose that was really humbling pause for reflection for all of us.
Ben, thank you very much. I think that was great. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. The term expeditionary hippies is going to stay with me, but a lot else as well. So thank you. As we said, the book's available, and you have an opportunity to support a good cause as well. So thank you all for coming. Thank you all for participating in this conversation. And I think Ben has earned himself a round of applause for not only for writing the book, but for presenting it today. Thank you.